A woman stands alone on a train platform in 1882, clutching a worn carpetbag and a faded photograph. The train that brought her disappears into the horizon, leaving nothing but dust and broken promises. She waits and waits, but nobody comes. What happens when society throws you away? When the people who promised to love you abandon you in a strange town with nothing but the clothes on your back? Most would break, most would give up. But this woman, she was about to discover that sometimes the most unexpected salvation comes from the most unlikely source. This is a story they don't want you to hear, a story about how a black rancher, a man society said had no right to own land, let alone offer refuge, became the only person willing to stand between a desperate woman and complete destitution. But what he offered her wasn't just shelter. It was something far more dangerous in 1882 America. Stay until the very end of this video, because what happens in the final chapter will shock you. It's a moment that changed not just two lives, but challenged everything their community believed about worth, dignity, and who deserves love. If you're new to The Black Rancher, you're about to discover why this channel is essential viewing. We uncover the hidden stories of black cowboys, ranchers, and pioneers who shaped the American West, stories that have been erased from history books for too long. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell, because these aren't just stories, they're reclaimed pieces of our heritage that everyone needs to hear. Share this video with someone who needs to know that heroes come in all colors and that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen when nobody's watching. Now let's begin. Colorado Territory, September 1882. The Denver and Rio Grande locomotive pulled away from Millbrook Station with a mournful whistle that seemed to mock Margaret Sullivan's predicament. At 28, she possessed a quiet dignity that no amount of travel dust could diminish. Though her brown traveling dress hung loose on her frame, evidence of the weight she'd lost during 3 weeks of anxious waiting back in Kansas City. Margaret clutched the crumpled telegram that had summoned her west. Come to Millbrook. Marriage arranged. Stop. James Whitmore. Stop. But James Whitmore was nowhere to be found. Station Master Harold Kemper, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, approached with obvious reluctance. Ma'am, I hate to say it, but you've been here 2 hours. The next eastbound don't come through for 3 days. I'm certain, mister. Whitmore will arrive shortly, Margaret replied, though uncertainty crept into her voice. Perhaps he's been delayed by ranch business. Kemper's expression softened with pity. Ma'am, ain't no James Whitmore in this county. I've lived here 12 years, know every spread within 50 miles. Sounds like somebody played you false. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She sank onto her carpetbag, the photograph of a handsome stranger, supposedly James Whitmore, fluttering from her fingers. The picture she'd treasured during her journey west now seemed like evidence of her gullibility. What am I supposed to do? She whispered, more to herself than to Kemper. Well, ma'am, there's the Millbrook Hotel, but... He shuffled his feet uncomfortably. Mrs. Henderson don't take kindly to unaccompanied women without proper arrangements, says it attracts the wrong element. Margaret had $37 to her name, her entire savings from working as a seamstress in Kansas City. After selling everything she owned to make this journey, she faced the terrifying reality of being stranded in a frontier town where she knew no one. As if summoned by her desperation, 3 women emerged from the hotel across the dusty street. Their leader, a sharp-featured woman in an expensive blue dress, surveyed Margaret with obvious disdain. Harold, the woman called. Who is this person cluttering up our station? Mrs. Henderson. This lady was expecting to meet someone, but seems there's been some confusion. Beatrice Henderson, wife of the town's bank president and self-appointed moral guardian of Millbrook, approached with the bearing of a general inspecting defeated troops. Let me guess. Mail-order bride arrangement gone wrong. We've seen your type before. I assure you, madam, I am a respectable woman. Margaret stood, drawing on reserves of dignity she didn't know she possessed. Respectable women don't travel unescorted to meet strange men, Mrs. Henderson sniffed. Clara, look at that dress. Poor quality fabric, probably from back east where they don't understand proper frontier fashion. And that complexion suggests she's been working outdoors most unseemly. Margaret's cheeks burned with humiliation as the women circled her like vultures. She'd endured whispered conversations about her unmarried status back in Kansas City, but this felt different, more vicious, more final. "Please," Margaret said quietly, "I just need somewhere to stay until I can arrange return passage." "The hotel maintains certain standards," Mrs. Henderson declared loudly enough for gathering onlookers to hear. "We can't harbor every wayward woman who shows up with a sob story. It would reflect poorly on our community's moral character." By now a crowd had gathered. Margaret felt dozens of eyes upon her, measuring, judging, finding her wanting. She was alone, abandoned, and quickly becoming the town's entertainment. That's when she heard the sound that would change everything, the steady clip-clop of a horse approaching at an unhurried pace, accompanied by the soft jingle of spurs. Ezekiel "Zeke" Porter swung down from his chestnut mare with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than on foot. At 35, he stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, earned from years of ranch work. His dark skin was weathered by the Colorado sun, and his steady brown eyes missed nothing as he assessed the scene unfolding at the train station. Zeke had ridden into Millbrook for supplies, not expecting to find a woman being publicly humiliated by the town's social elite. But something about Margaret's quiet dignity in the face of their cruelty stirred something protective in his chest. "Good afternoon, folks," Zeke said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Seems like quite a gathering for such a small station." The crowd's mood shifted instantly. Several men stepped back, hands instinctively moving toward their guns. Beatrice Henderson's face hardened with disgust. "Porter," she spat, "this doesn't concern you. Return to your establishment and leave decent people to handle town business." Zeke ignored her, focusing instead on Margaret. "Ma'am, you appear to be in some distress. Is there anything I can do to assist?" Margaret looked up at this unexpected ally, a black man willing to intervene when no white person had offered help. His kind eyes and respectful tone stood in stark contrast to the hostility surrounding her. "I'm afraid I've been misled about arrangements here," she said carefully. "I was expecting to meet someone who apparently doesn't exist." "That's a hard situation," Zeke acknowledged. "Where were you planning to stay?" "She's not staying anywhere in this town," Mrs. Henderson interjected. "We don't need her kind attracting undesirable elements." Zeke's jaw tightened. "Her kind? You mean a lady in need of assistance?" "Don't you dare lecture me about propriety," Mrs. Henderson's voice rose shrilly. "A Negro has no business interfering in white folks' affairs, especially when it involves a woman of questionable virtue." The tension crackled like electricity before a storm. Zeke had faced this attitude countless times since settling in Colorado 5 years ago, but it never stopped stinging. He owned the most successful horse ranch in the county, employed 6 men, and had never caused trouble. Yet to people like Beatrice Henderson, his skin color made him perpetually suspect. "Mrs. Henderson," Zeke said with deliberate calm, "I'm offering Christian charity to a stranded traveler. I believe your own church preaches such virtues." "Not from the likes of you," she sneered. Margaret watched this exchange with growing amazement. This man, who clearly faced his own prejudices, was risking social ostracism to defend her honor. When no one else would speak up, he had stepped forward. "Sir," Margaret addressed Zeke directly, "I appreciate your concern, but I don't want to cause you trouble. Ma'am, the only trouble here is watching good people suffer when help is available." Zeke's voice carried conviction born from personal experience. "I run a horse ranch about 5 miles south of town. It's a respectable operation with proper accommodations. You're welcome to stay until you can sort out your situation." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A black man offering shelter to a white woman was scandalous enough, but doing so publicly challenged every social boundary in 1882 Colorado. "Absolutely not," Mrs. Henderson declared. "Such an arrangement would be improper beyond measure. The very suggestion is offensive." "More offensive than leaving a lady to sleep in the street?" Zeke asked pointedly. Margaret felt the weight of every stare, every whispered judgment. These people had already decided she was worthless, undeserving of basic human kindness. But this stranger, this man they clearly despised, was offering exactly what she needed: sanctuary and respect. "Mr. Porter," she said, straightening her shoulders, "I would be grateful to accept your generous offer." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Mrs. Henderson's face turned purple with indignation. "This is disgraceful. Mark my words, no respectable person will have anything to do with either of you after this day." Zeke helped Margaret gather her belongings, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the hostile atmosphere. "Ma'am, sometimes you have to choose between what's right and what's acceptable. I learned long ago those aren't always the same thing." As they prepared to leave, Margaret noticed how Zeke positioned himself between her and the angry crowd, a subtle but unmistakable act of protection. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she felt safe. "What's your name, ma'am?" Zeke asked as he helped her into his wagon. "Margaret Sullivan. And thank you, Mr. Porter. I won't forget this kindness." "Call me Zeke. And ma'am, you don't owe me thanks for doing what any decent person should do." As the wagon rolled away from the station, Margaret looked back to see the crowd still watching, their faces twisted with disapproval. She was leaving behind the life she'd planned, but perhaps that life had been an illusion anyway. Beside her, Zeke drove with quiet confidence, seemingly unbothered by the storm of controversy they'd just created. Margaret wondered what kind of man possessed such strength of character, and what kind of life she was entering at his ranch. Before we continue with Margaret and Zeke's story, I need you to understand something important. You're watching The Black Rancher, the only channel dedicated to sharing the untold stories of black pioneers who shaped the American West. Stories like this one, where a black rancher's act of basic human decency was seen as revolutionary, happened thousands of times across the frontier. But they've been erased from our history books. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell right now, because these stories matter. They show us that courage, honor, and compassion have no color, and that some of America's greatest heroes have been deliberately forgotten. Share this video with someone who believes in justice, because Margaret and Zeke's story is about to take a turn that will challenge everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and standing up for what's right in the face of an entire community's disapproval. Now let's see what happens when they reach the ranch, 5 miles south of Millbrook. The Porter Ranch stretched across a valley blessed with abundant grass and a clear running creek. Margaret's first glimpse of the property dispelled any preconceptions about Zeke's establishment. The main house was a well-built log structure with a wide front porch, surrounded by neat outbuildings, sturdy corrals, and pastures dotted with some of the finest horses she'd ever seen. "It's beautiful," she said, genuine admiration in her voice. Zeke's pride was evident as he surveyed his domain. Took 5 years to build it up to this point. Started with nothing but 40 acres of scrubland and a broken-down cabin. As they approached the house, 3 ranch hands emerged from the barn. Margaret was surprised to see they were racially mixed, 2 white men and 1 Hispanic, all treating Zeke with obvious respect rather than deference. "Boss," called out Tommy Richardson, a weather-beaten cowboy in his 50s, "didn't expect you back with company." "Tommy, this is Miss Sullivan. She'll be staying in the guest room while she sorts out some travel complications," Zeke explained. "Miss Sullivan, these are my men, Tommy Richardson, Jake Morrison, and Carlos Mendez, best horse handlers in Colorado." The men tipped their hats politely, though Margaret caught the curious glances they exchanged. News of their arrival would spread quickly. "Ma'am," Tommy said, "any friend of the boss is welcome here. We'll make sure you're comfortable." Margaret was struck by the easy camaraderie between Zeke and his employees. There was none of the racial tension she'd witnessed in town, just mutual respect among working men. The guest room was clean and comfortable, with handmade furniture and a window overlooking the horse pastures. Most importantly, it had a lock on the door, a small but significant gesture of respect for her privacy and safety. "I hope this suits you," Zeke said, setting her bag on the quilt-covered bed. "Rosa Mendez, Carlos's wife, comes up from their cabin to cook and clean. She'll bring you hot water for washing." "It's perfect," Margaret assured him. "More than I expected or deserve." "Ma'am, respect isn't something you have to earn or deserve. It's something every person should receive as a matter of course." That evening, Margaret joined Zeke and his hands for dinner. Rosa Mendez had prepared a hearty meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie. The conversation was lively, filled with talk of horses, weather, and gentle teasing among the men who clearly functioned as an extended family. "Miss Sullivan," Jake Morrison asked, "if you don't mind me asking, what brought you all the way to Colorado?" Margaret hesitated, then decided honesty was the best policy among people who'd shown her such kindness. "I answered a matrimonial advertisement. A man named James Whitmore claimed to own a ranch near Millbrook and wanted a wife. But when I arrived—" "There ain't no James Whitmore in these parts," Tommy confirmed. "Sounds like you got taken by a confidence man. They prey on folks looking for new starts out west." "I should have known better," Margaret said bitterly. "I was foolish to believe a stranger's promises." "Ma'am," Zeke said gently, "wanting something better for yourself isn't foolish. It's human. The fault lies with whoever deceived you, not with your hope for a better life." After dinner, Margaret sat on the front porch with Zeke, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The peaceful scene was so different from the chaos of her arrival that it felt like entering another world. "Mr. Porter, Zeke, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you help me today? You don't know me, and defending me certainly didn't make you any friends in town." Zeke was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "I reckon because I know what it feels like to be judged before people know who you are, to have folks decide your worth based on something you can't control. But you've built something remarkable here. You're clearly successful and respected by your men." "Took a long time to get here," Zeke admitted. "When I first came to Colorado, people said a black man had no business owning land, let alone running a ranch. Some tried to run me off. Others refused to do business with me." "What changed?" "Time, hard work, and proving that character matters more than color, though some folks still refuse to see it." Margaret understood. She'd faced her own judgments back east, whispers about the spinster seamstress who worked to support herself instead of finding a husband. Society seemed determined to find fault with anyone who didn't fit its narrow definitions of acceptable. "I notice your hands treat you as their equal," she observed. Zeke chuckled. "Tommy and Jake were down on their luck when I hired them. Couldn't find work anywhere else because they were getting too old for most outfits. Carlos fled Mexico after his family was killed by bandits. We all know what it's like to be cast aside. Makes you appreciate people who judge you by your actions instead of your circumstances." Over the following days, Margaret settled into an unexpected routine. She helped Rosa with cooking and mending, tasks that felt natural after years of seamstress work. She learned about horse breeding from watching Zeke work with his animals, amazed by his gentle patience with even the most skittish colts. Most surprisingly, she found herself genuinely happy for the first time in years. The ranch was like a small kingdom where worth was measured by character and contribution rather than social status or skin color. But their peaceful existence was about to be shattered by forces beyond their control. 1 week later, Margaret was hanging laundry behind the house when the sound of approaching riders made her look up nervously. 6 men on horseback were riding hard toward the ranch, dust clouds marking their urgent approach. Zeke emerged from the barn, his expression instantly alert. He recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Ben Caulfield, a fair man who'd always treated him with professional respect. But the others were strangers, and their grim faces suggested trouble. "Zeke!" Sheriff Caulfield called as he dismounted. "We need to talk." "Sheriff, what brings you out here with such a large party?" The answer came from one of the strangers, a well-dressed man with cold blue eyes and a marshal's badge on his vest. "I'm Deputy Marshal Frank Morrison, investigating a theft that occurred in Kansas City 3 weeks ago." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She stepped back toward the house, hoping to avoid notice, but Marshal Morrison's sharp gaze had already found her. "You there, woman, come here." Margaret approached on unsteady legs, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been dreading this moment since arriving in Colorado, hoping against hope that her past wouldn't follow her west. "State your name," Morrison demanded. "Margaret Sullivan. Also known as Margaret O'Brien?" Margaret's silence was answer enough. Zeke stepped closer to her, sensing danger he didn't yet understand. Margaret O'Brien, Morrison continued, you're wanted for questioning in connection with the theft of $200 from the Fairmont Hotel in Kansas City, where you were employed as a seamstress. That's impossible, Zeke said firmly. Miss Sullivan is a guest at my ranch and has conducted herself with complete propriety. Morrison laughed harshly. Your guest fled Kansas City the day after hotel guests reported missing money from their rooms. She disappeared without notice, leaving behind debts and a reputation for sticky fingers. I never stole anything, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Fairmont accused me because she needed someone to blame when her wealthy guests complained. I left because I knew no one would believe my word against theirs. Convenient story, Morrison sneered. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Sheriff Caulfield looked uncomfortable with the proceedings. Marshal, maybe we should discuss this more privately. Nothing private about it, Morrison declared. This woman is a known thief who seduced this man into harboring her, probably planning to rob him too once she gained his trust. The words hit Zeke like physical blows. After everything he'd overcome to build his reputation, he was being accused of harboring a criminal. Worse, the implication that Margaret had seduced him carried dangerous racial undertones that could destroy everything he'd worked for. Ma'am, Zeke said quietly to Margaret, is what he's saying true? Margaret met his eyes, knowing that her answer would determine both their fates. I never stole anything from those hotel guests, but yes, I am Margaret O'Brien. I changed my name because I knew the accusations would follow me everywhere. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew you wouldn't have helped me if you'd known. No one believes a woman accused of theft, especially when the accusers are wealthy and influential. Zeke studied her face, searching for deception and finding none. He'd spent a week watching Margaret's character in action, her kindness to Rosa, her gentle way with the horses, her willingness to work without being asked. Those weren't the actions of a calculating thief. Marshal, Zeke said, what proof do you have besides accusations? The word of respectable citizens is proof enough, Morrison replied. Now step aside. I'm taking her back to Kansas City to face justice. No. The single word hung in the air like a gunshot. Everyone turned to stare at Zeke, who stood with quiet determination between Margaret and the marshal. I beg your pardon? Morrison's voice was dangerously low. I said no. You have no warrant, only accusations. Miss O'Brien has committed no crime in Colorado territory, and I won't stand by while she's dragged away without proper legal proceedings. Boy, Morrison snarled, using the word like a weapon. You're interfering with federal law enforcement. That's a serious crime. I'm exercising my rights as a property owner and citizen, Zeke replied evenly. If you want to question Miss O'Brien, you can do so through proper legal channels with proper evidence. Sheriff Caulfield stepped forward, clearly trying to defuse the situation. Zeke, maybe it would be better if she came to town voluntarily, answered some questions. Ben, you know me. Have I ever given you reason to doubt my judgment? The sheriff looked conflicted. He did know Zeke, had seen him build his ranch through honest hard work, had watched him employ men others wouldn't hire, had witnessed his integrity in business dealings. But he also knew the political realities of 1882 Colorado. Marshal Morrison, Sheriff Caulfield said carefully, perhaps we should return to town and discuss proper procedures. There's nothing to discuss, Morrison snapped. Porter, you have until tomorrow morning to turn over the fugitive, or I'll return with federal marshals and arrest you for harboring a criminal, and don't think your previous service will protect you. The reference to Zeke's military service during the Civil War was clearly meant as an insult rather than recognition. Morrison remounted his horse, his cold eyes promising future trouble. Tomorrow morning, Porter. Don't make this harder than it has to be. As the riders departed, Margaret sank onto the porch steps, overwhelmed by despair. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I've destroyed everything for you. Zeke sat beside her, his mind racing through options. Tell me what really happened in Kansas City. Margaret's story tumbled out, how she'd worked for the Fairmont Hotel for 2 years, saving every penny for a better life. How Mrs. Fairmont had always treated her with barely concealed contempt. How wealthy guests began reporting missing items, and Mrs. Fairmont had immediately accused Margaret without investigation. I knew it was pointless to fight the accusations, Margaret finished. A seamstress's word against prominent citizens. I would have been convicted regardless of the truth. So you ran. I ran. And when that matrimonial advertisement appeared promising a new start in Colorado, it seemed like providence. I never imagined it was fake or that my past would follow me here. Zeke was quiet for a long time, processing the implications. If he continued to protect Margaret, he risked losing everything: his ranch, his reputation, possibly his freedom. But if he abandoned her now, he would prove that his principles only mattered when they were convenient. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked. "I'm thinking," Zeke said slowly, "that sometimes a man has to decide what kind of person he wants to be. And I'd rather lose everything standing for what's right than keep everything by abandoning someone who needs help." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You can't sacrifice your life for me. It's too much. Ma'am, the day I stop helping people in need is the day I stop being the man I want to be." That night, as Margaret lay awake in the guest room, she could hear Zeke pacing on the front porch. Through her window, she watched him sitting alone under the stars, probably wrestling with the impossible decision she'd forced upon him. Tomorrow would bring Deputy Marshal Morrison and whatever consequences Zeke's defiance might provoke. Margaret had fled Kansas City to escape judgment, only to bring it crashing down on the one person who'd shown her unconditional kindness. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, she carried with her the memory of Zeke's unwavering voice saying, "No." For the first time in her life, someone had stood up for her when it mattered most. Stop right there. If you're feeling the tension building in this story, you need to understand why the Black Rancher exists. What you're watching isn't just entertainment, it's reclaimed history. Zeke Porter's choice to stand up to federal authority to protect an innocent woman. That kind of moral courage defined thousands of black pioneers who've been erased from America's story. This channel is the only place you'll find these authentic tales of black cowboys, ranchers, and everyday heroes who helped build the West. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because these stories are too important to miss. Share this video right now, because Margaret and Zeke's story is about to reach a climax that will leave you speechless. What happens when a black rancher faces down the full power of 1882 law enforcement? The answer will restore your faith in human courage. Don't go anywhere. Chapter 5 will change everything you think you know about heroism. Dawn, September 15, 1882. Margaret woke to the sound of horses approaching. Many horses. Through her window, she could see at least a dozen riders cresting the hill, led by Deputy Marshal Morrison. Behind him rode Sheriff Caulfield, 2 federal marshals, and a group of armed townsmen including several members of Beatrice Henderson's social circle. Zeke was already on the front porch, dressed in his best clothes with his father's Civil War cavalry saber at his side, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of his service to the country that now threatened to destroy him. Margaret dressed quickly and joined him outside. "Zeke, please reconsider. I can't let you lose everything because of me. Ma'am, my daddy was born a slave in Virginia. He told me that freedom isn't something someone gives you. It's something you take by standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything." The riders formed a semicircle around the house. Deputy Marshal Morrison dismounted with theatrical authority, flanked by his fellow marshals. "Porter, your time is up. Turn over the fugitive." "Marshal, I've consulted with my attorney," Zeke replied calmly. "Colorado territory law requires proper extradition proceedings for accused persons. You have no warrant, no evidence of wrongdoing in this jurisdiction, and no legal authority to remove Miss O'Brien without due process." Morrison's face darkened. "Don't quote law to me, boy. You're harboring a known criminal." "I'm providing sanctuary to an innocent woman who's been falsely accused." From the group of townsmen, Beatrice Henderson's voice rang out shrilly. "This is what comes of allowing such people to own property. They think they can defy decent society." But other voices rose in response. Tommy Richardson, Jake Morrison, and Carlos Mendez had positioned themselves strategically around the property, with several neighboring ranchers who'd come to support Zeke. "Boss treated us fair when nobody else would," Tommy called out. "If he says the lady's innocent, that's good enough for us." To Margaret's amazement, she recognized one of the supporting ranchers as Samuel Patterson, whose prize stallion Zeke had treated for injury the previous month. Another was David Chen, a Chinese immigrant who'd faced his own persecution, but had found acceptance in Zeke's circle. Sheriff Caulfield looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized the situation was spiraling toward potential violence. "Marshal Morrison, perhaps we should step back and consider—" "I'm done considering," Morrison snarled. He turned to his fellow marshals. "Arrest them both, the woman for theft, the man for obstruction of justice." That's when Margaret made the decision that would define the rest of her life. "Wait," she called out, stepping forward. "I'll come with you willingly, but only if you agree to one condition." "You're in no position to make conditions," Morrison replied. "Actually, I am." Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word. "Because before I left Kansas City, I made copies of certain hotel records, receipts, guest registrations, staff schedules, documents that prove I wasn't even working the days those thefts allegedly occurred." The crowd stirred with murmurs. Morrison's confident expression faltered slightly. "I was willing to run rather than fight because I was scared and alone," Margaret continued. "But I'm not alone anymore. And I won't let Zeke Porter suffer for my cowardice." She reached into her traveling bag and produced a small bundle of papers. "These documents prove my innocence, but more importantly, they reveal that Mrs. Fairmont was embezzling from her own hotel and needed a scapegoat when her wealthy guests started asking questions." Morrison lunged for the papers, but Margaret held them high. "Sheriff Caulfield, as a law enforcement officer of Colorado Territory, I formally request protective custody while these documents are examined by proper authorities." It was a brilliant legal maneuver. By placing herself under local jurisdiction and providing evidence, Margaret had neutralized Morrison's federal authority while giving Zeke legal cover for his protection. Sheriff Caulfield, recognizing a way out of an impossible situation, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I accept your request for protective custody. These documents will be examined thoroughly before any extradition decisions are made." "This is irregular," Morrison protested. "So is trying to arrest people without proper warrants," Sheriff Caulfield replied firmly. "Ma'am, you're under the protection of local law enforcement pending investigation." The crowd of townspeople looked stunned by this unexpected development. Beatrice Henderson's group retreated in confused whispers, while Zeke's supporters broke into cheers. But the real shock came when Margaret turned to face Zeke directly. "I have one more thing to say," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Zeke Porter is the finest man I've ever known. He risked everything to help a stranger, showed me kindness when the world turned its back, and demonstrated more courage in 1 week than most people show in a lifetime." She paused, gathering courage for words that would scandalize 1882 society. "If he'll have me, I'd be honored to become his wife." The silence was deafening. In an era when interracial relationships were not just taboo but dangerous, Margaret had just proposed marriage to a black man in front of half the county. Zeke stared at her in amazement. "Ma'am, you don't have to—" "I'm not saying this out of gratitude," Margaret interrupted. "I'm saying it because over the past week, I've fallen in love with your character, your integrity, and your heart. If you feel the same way, then let's build something beautiful together. If not, I'll understand. But I needed you to know." For a long moment, Zeke couldn't speak. Then a slow smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that comes from recognizing a miracle. "Miss Margaret O'Brien," he said formally, "I would be honored to be your husband." The crowd erupted in chaos, some cheering, others outraged, all stunned by the unexpected turn of events. Deputy Marshal Morrison, faced with legal complications and a rapidly deteriorating situation, chose retreat over confrontation. "This isn't over," he warned as he mounted his horse. "Yes, it is," Sheriff Caulfield replied quietly. "Miss O'Brien is under my jurisdiction now, and if her documents prove her innocence, which I suspect they will, there's nothing more to discuss." As the official party departed, Margaret and Zeke found themselves surrounded by well-wishers from the local ranching community. Not everyone approved, but enough did to make their future possible. 3 months later, after Margaret's innocence had been thoroughly documented and the charges dismissed, She and Zeke were married by a circuit preacher in the front yard of the Porter Ranch. Tommy Richardson gave the bride away. Rosa Mendez prepared the wedding feast, and Sheriff Caulfield served as an official witness. It wasn't the wedding Margaret had once dreamed of, but it was something far more precious, a celebration of love that had triumphed over prejudice, fear, and the judgments of small minds. 5 years later, 1887, the Porter Ranch had grown to encompass nearly 2,000 acres, making it one of the largest horse operations in Colorado Territory. Margaret had proven to be a natural horsewoman with an exceptional eye for breeding bloodlines. Together, she and Zeke had built something unprecedented, a successful interracial marriage in the heart of the American frontier. Their 3 children, Samuel, age 4, Rebecca, age 2, and baby Isaiah, played in the same yard where their mother had once faced down a federal marshal. The local school, initially reluctant to accept mixed-race children, had been won over by Margaret's offer to teach advanced mathematics and literature to all students, regardless of background. Beatrice Henderson had moved back east after her husband's bank failed, partly due to boycotts by ranchers who supported the Porters. Sheriff Ben Caulfield had been elected to the territorial legislature, where he championed civil rights legislation. Even some of the townspeople who'd initially opposed the marriage had come to respect the Porter family's contributions to the community. But the most remarkable change was in Margaret herself. The frightened woman who'd once stood alone on a train platform had become a confident rancher's wife, respected throughout the territory for her business acumen and unwavering moral courage. She'd learned that true belonging came not from society's approval, but from standing with people who valued character over convention. As Margaret watched Zeke teaching their son to ride, she reflected on the journey that had brought them together. A fake matrimonial advertisement had shattered her old life, but that destruction had cleared the path for something infinitely better, a love built on mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to defy a world that said they didn't belong together. The Porter Ranch had become more than a successful business. It was a beacon of hope for anyone who'd ever been told they weren't worthy of love, respect, or a second chance. It proved that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from building something so beautiful that it makes their hatred irrelevant. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the ranch work was done, Margaret and Zeke would sit on their front porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains gold. They'd built their own world, one where love conquered prejudice, where character mattered more than color, and where two people's courage to stand together had created a legacy that would echo through generations. Margaret had come west seeking a husband and found something far more precious, herself. Zeke had offered shelter to a stranger and discovered a partner who made him stronger. Together, they'd proven that sometimes the most unlikely love stories become the most enduring legends. Their story became part of local folklore, the tale of the black rancher who defied society to protect an innocent woman, and the woman who found her voice by standing up for the man she loved. It was a reminder that in the vast American West, courage and compassion could overcome any obstacle, and that the greatest frontiers weren't geographical. They were matters of the heart. This is why the Black Rancher exists. Margaret and Zeke's story isn't just about two people falling in love. It's about the courage to stand up for what's right when the entire world is against you. It's about how black pioneers like Zeke Porter built the American West through sheer determination, facing down prejudice with dignity and strength. If this story moved you, you need to subscribe to The Black Rancher right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're uncovering dozens of these forgotten tales, stories of black cowboys, ranchers, lawmen, and everyday heroes who shaped America but were erased from our history books. Share this video with everyone you know, because these stories belong to all of us. They remind us that courage has no color, that love conquers hate, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept injustice. Comment below and tell us what part of Margaret and Zeke's story touched you most. Was it Zeke's decision to risk everything for a stranger? Margaret's courage to propose marriage in front of hostile townspeople? Or their ultimate triumph over the prejudices of their time? Watch our next video about the Buffalo Soldier who built an empire, another incredible true story that will amaze you. And remember, every subscription helps us continue bringing these vital stories to light. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about these hidden histories. And thank you for believing that every story of courage deserves to be told. Until next time, this is The Black Rancher, reminding you that heroes come in all colors, and their stories are just waiting to be discovered. God bless, and we'll see you in the next video.